All right, this new chapter that we're starting is the settling of the 13 colonies. Last chapter, we talked about the beginnings of exploration and the movement into the New World. And so now we're going to talk about the specific settling of each colony. But before we jump into this new chapter, what I'd like you to do is to, on the index card that I've passed out to you, write your name, date, and admit at the top of one side of your index card. And I'd like you to write down any information that you recall from the reading of this particular section from your homework last night. So this could be any bold print terms and what they mean, a person, a place, any key facts, or even small details that you would like to include. Write it on your index card. And I'll pause for just a moment for you to go ahead and do that. Now what I'd like you to do is write down any questions that you have, or topics or questions that you think will be interesting to discuss with a partner. So focus your questions to page 20 of your reading. So if you need to use your book at this point, you may. Go through just page 20, look at the your bold print terms, your headings, italicized words to kind of trigger your memory, graphs, pictures, or even captions. Any questions you think that might be something you'd like to discuss with another partner, maybe something you didn't understand that a partner might understand. You can also use your 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, to kind of help you write some of these questions. So I'll pause again and you can go ahead and write that. And this is all going to be on the admit side of your index card. Don't use the back yet because we're going to use that later. All right, so now I'm going to have you break up into your partners that I've assigned, and I want you to ask your partner your discussion question. So after your discussion, and then after your discussion with your partner, you're going to select one question to share with your class, and I want you to be prepared to share the highlights of your discussion with the class as well. So first, we'll just start with you asking your partner your discussion questions and discussing the question itself with your partner. And I'll pause just for a moment for you to do that. All right, now after you've discussed with your partner, just choose one question or topic that you discuss with your partner and share. And I'd like for a handful of you, I'm going to call on a few of you if you don't volunteer, but I'm going to have just want you to share those highlights of that discussion. So tell us your question and the answer to the question, and anything else about that particular question or topic that you discussed. All right, so let's jump in. So now that we've kind of gotten a broad overview of this particular section, the financial support and colonial organization for the 13 colonies, let's jump in together as a class, and I'm going to go through the notes and for just this one section, and then we're actually going to repeat that same activity on the admit side of your index card with the physical hardship section of your text. But before we do that, let's go ahead and look at the notes for the financial support and colonial organization. So there were a lot of problems from the outset with settling the 13 colonies. One of the big problems was that founding a new colony was very expensive. So as you can imagine, you weren't just coming to a new town. Like maybe perhaps you've moved before in your lifetime. It's not like where, when you move, you can go to Walmart once you get to your new town and stock your new fridge in your new house. It didn't work like that. It's not like when you move to a new town and maybe your dad, when you moved into your new house, there were a few things that needed to be fixed, or maybe you wanted to paint your room a certain color. It was just a matter of you popping on down to Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever your local hardware store is, and getting what you need, coming on back and fixing it. That's not how the colonies worked, because you didn't have your Lowe's or Home Depot or your Walmart or your Sam's Club. You didn't have access to those things. And instead, when you got to the new world, all that you had was what you brought with you. So not only did they have to pack for the voyage itself, they also had to pack and prepare for for their stay there in the New World until they could grow the crops they needed, and they could build a shelter and build a home, and they of course had to get all the materials that required. So it was a very arduous process, and it was a very expensive one in order to get all those materials and supplies together that you needed. Not to mention that you also needed money to be able to hire ships, a captain and a crew, in order to bring you to the New World. And some men, like for example, Sir Walter Raleigh, he actually, some of these men actually risked their entire fortunes in order to pay for to this journey to the New World. And some, like Raleigh, actually never did get anything to show for their effort. So to pay for colonies, some English investors formed a joint stock company. Now, a joint stock company, an example of that would be Jamestown, was one colony that was founded through this process of this joint stock. So these businessmen were the forerunners of basically our modern corporations. What these men would do is they'd get a group of men, typically Englishmen, and they would put their money together. So rather than just one person risking their entire fortune, or even one or two people, a group of men would take portions of their fortune, pool it together. And that's why it's called a joint, because it goes together. Think of like, joint in your body. It takes, more than one piece. So they would put forth parts of their fortune in order to invest their money into their stock and into the stock, and they would then use that money to pay to form their colony. And so that when the businessmen invested in the colony, they were hoping that eventually the colony would prosper, and then of course they would make a profit off of this venture. But this process helped lower the risk, and even if the venture failed, they wouldn't be out their entire fortune. The king gave each colony or each company a charter for establishing its colony, and each charter contained rules governing where a colony would be located and how it would be administered. So a charter was a permission for the founding of a colony, and so colonies founded with these particular conditions were called charter colonies. Now there were other types of colonies as well. For example, another type of colony that did not have necessarily use this particular process were called proprietary colonies. These colonies were pieces of land in the New World that the king gave to individuals or groups. Sometimes it was because he had a good relationship with them and kind of wanted to show them favor, or sometimes it was because he owed them a favor. We'll actually talk about that a little bit later. Sometimes the king would borrow money, and so and if he didn't have the money to pay it back, sometimes he would give land to pay that debt. And actually, that's how one of the colonies was formed. So that's a proprietary colony. And so the men that received these pieces of land from the king were called proprietors, and they could govern their colony however they saw fit. Now the charter was very much underneath the document. So whatever the king put into that document was how it was run. But a proprietary colony was based on how the proprietor chose to run it. And then there was a royal colony, and this is where the king took a direct control of the colony. Usually he put a governor in charge of it, and that governor will report back to the king on how things were going and on any decisions that needed to be made. So if you notice, there are three different types or ways that the colony was run, and this is actually going to be a problem that actually is going to be one of the reasons why we end up in the American Revolution, is because these colonists within these colonies were used to different ways of things being run, and so when the king tries to take over, especially some of the more free, if I can use that word, structured colonies, ones that had been used to really governing themselves and having very little king oversight, when the king starts to exert that authority, that's why they get so frustrated. One of the reasons why they get so frustrated and upset. So this particular method of allowing for there to be 3 different ways in which these colonies will run is ultimately going to be one of the reasons why we end up in the revolution there in the future. So now let's circle back to our discussion questions. So looking at page 21, and just a smidge, there's like 4 or 5 sentences on page 22. Looking at that, if you need to kind of trigger your memory if you need, write in any questions about this particular section of your text using your 5 W's. Look at your blueprint terms. There's a great chart in there that might be of help. Anything that you can't have any questions about. And I'll pause and give you a moment to do that. All right, and then we're going to do our think, pair, share. So get with your partner and discuss any of those questions that you have. All right, and come on back as a group. And now as a class, we're going to discuss how basically what we just did a moment ago. I'm looking for people that have not yet talked in front of the class. What I'd like you to do is select one question, the answer to that question, and any other details that would be relevant to our discussion in class. And we'll go ahead and share those. All right, so let's talk just briefly here about the main 4 hardships that the colonists faced in order to survive in the New World. So like I mentioned before, they, of course, have had their voyage to the New World, and that in itself was a very hazardous voyage in itself. And so you faced, of course, storms. If you didn't pack enough food, shortage of supplies, but also you were in very tight quarters as well. Then also there were other dangers once you reached the new land. You had food and shelter, of course, were your immediate needs, because then you would, if you didn't get your shelter, you would perhaps die of exposure to the elements. You also needed food in order to survive the long winter months. And so, for example, like in Jamestown, more than half of the original colonists died of either scurvy, fever, or exposure in the colony's first 3 months. So if often you did not have the food or the shelter that you needed, if you didn't die of exposure first, you might die of an illness related to one of those, either of perhaps starvation or also just general malnutrition. Makes it difficult for your body to fight off an illness that it normally would have been capable of fighting off in of itself. And then relationships with the Indians were also a problem. And although some Indians were very friendly, many began to turn against the Europeans when they saw that the Europeans were just coming in and taking their land. So in 1622, an Indian attack actually wiped out 300 settlers around Jamestown. So that by 1700, there was less of a threat, but regions in the south and along the western frontier began to be in danger from Indians. So all these dangers together meant that it was very difficult for them to venture out into this new world and to create a life for themselves. Now, so what I'd like you to do at this point would be for you to turn over your index card and exit the top, and then I want you to write down any information that you recall from our class. It can be from your discussions, maybe a question that you had, and you found out the answer. Write that down on your index card. Anything from our discussion or anything from the lesson today, you go ahead and write that down on your exit slip, and then before the bell rings, I'd like you to turn it in on your way out the door.